The Cobb Building was built in 1882 by Annie and Benjamin Hogue as a trading post. Annie operated the store while her husband, Captain Hogue, traded with the West Indies and Jacksonville, because the Indian River was like a highway, and it was used for trade as well as pleasure at that time. Some good stories are told about them. Annie was quite a feisty woman, and her real name was quite long because she was of Scottish ancestry, so she had a lot of family names in there. She was called Annie, Jessie, Kincaid, Donaldson, Yorkston, and she was from Northumberland in Scotland. She married her husband against her family's wishes, so they left and came to America. She sold some of her jewels to be able to pay for their land and buildings down here. One time, the Indians were very upset because some strangers had come and found some Indian bones and then taken them up to the Smithsonian building in Washington. And they wanted those bones back because it was one of their members who was buried out in the country. So they threatened to go on the warpath. Well, a lot of the citizens left Fort Pierce and went across the river to North Beach where the House of Refuge was, and they took refuge there. But not Annie. She got her gun and her ladder, and she climbed the ladder up to the attic of her store, and she stayed there with her gun all night, ready to shoot anybody who came in and tried to take the merchandise. The store was sold after a couple of years, and it became home for a canning company. Oysters were harvested from the river and canned there, and this area was south of Moores Creek, so it became known as Can Town. The people who were here were from Connecticut, who bought the company, and Casanova, New York. So it was quite a popular place, and people started rebuilding homes and businesses down in that area. Peter Cobb ended up being with the canning company, but then he stayed after they sold it after about a year or two. They said they had harvested all the oysters in the river, but most local people say that's not true. They just couldn't stand all the mosquitoes and bugs and things that were around. So this is how Peter Cobb became the prominent owner of the building, and he was quite the man. Children loved to break a window in his store because he didn't argue at them if they hit the baseball that far. Oftentimes he would give them free candy when they came in. Of course, it was penny candy, but it still was candy and pretty good. He had everything to eat, wear, and use, which was his motto. And behind the store was a carriage house because he delivered with a horse and buggy and a driver to people who could call in their order along Indian River Drive. And sometimes the mosquitoes were so bad that the driver would abandon the horse and the carriage just to get out of where the mosquitoes were. And excuse me. In addition to general merchandise, he also had a small post office addition put onto the Cobb store. And he didn't like the name Cantown, and he didn't want to have a post office that had the name Cantown. So he got a few friends together, and they decided to make a different name for Cantown. And so they took the name of the military fort, which was about a mile south along Indian River Drive, and built in 1838 during the Second Seminole Indian War. And they called this town then became Fort Pierce. The military fort had already burned down, so there wasn't any competition that way. The post office boxes are still in use today in the same building by the current tenants. As the store developed into a trading center, Cobb's Landing was built, and this landing was a dock that was built on the east side of the building and extended 1,200 feet into the river. And it had a set of narrow gauge rails so that heavy loads could be brought to the store. And later on, the rails were extended up to the railroad when it came here in 1894. So it was a good means of transporting the goods from the boat onto the dock, onto the narrow gauge, and then up to the train freight depot. It also was the hub of the early communities. If you've read Land Remembered, they were talking about a trading post where the cowboys and Indians came and that's supposed to have been what today is Cobb's store. Back then, though, it was the trading post that Annie and Captain Hogue had. But farmers, cattlemen, and Indians from the interior still came to town to trade for goods brought in by boat. They could be shipped onto the Indian River by boat, that was sailboat, and later by paddle wheel steamboats. After 50 years of being a store of general merchandise, the Pitts family bought the Cobb store and converted it to reconditioned mattresses, which they took old mattresses and reconditioned them for the owner. And then they developed that into Pitts Furniture Store and Pitts Gas Company. And it was quite the downtown business for a long time, because Pitts Gas Company had trucks that came around to the neighborhood and filled up your gas tank, and they would fix your gas stove that you bought at Pitts. And the Pitts family worked there. Usually we think of Buddy Pitts, who was the main person, who also had a Chris Craft dealership there and sold one of those boats to the famous Zach Mosley, who wrote Smiling Jack and who lived in Stewart. The furniture business stayed there for 50 years, and the store then became pretty run down and was up for sale. $750,000 they were asking for that store and property. And the historical groups in town were really upset because it was one of the oldest buildings. And they went to the realtor and said, gee, is there anything we can do to save this building and land? And he said, no, anybody that pays $750,000 for this land is going to tear down that old building. Well, he was wrong, because David Cleveland, who was an architect, and a young man, he stepped in, climbed over the building, under the building, in the building, between the building, everything. He was in and out and over and under the entire development store there. And he brought the building back to a multi-purpose building with an eye to keep his historical character in a modern world. So he has offices on the second floor, and downstairs there are individual little stores with different owners. So it still is a commercial building in this modern world. Later on, in 1998, Adams Ranch became the proud owner of this store. As a boy, Bud Alto Adams spent time in and around the P.P. Cobb General Store, and he feels that it is important to protect this historical focal point in the city of Fort Pierce.